We'll go ahead and get started here. I'm Phil Kim, president of the Michelson 20mm Foundation. For those of you who are not yet familiar with our work, we've been in this space for about a decade working to support higher education institutions, nonprofits, entrepreneurs, and startups, building new technology, new models with the promise of improving educational access, affordability, and equity. While we were planning to actually have our visionary founder on video live with us this morning, as fate would have it, he is actually in a location without sufficient broadband to stream live, but we do have him dialed in. So I do want to hand it over to Dr. Gary Michelson, who with his wife, Alia Michelson, have committed the majority of their resources towards charitable endeavors as catalytic philanthropists. Hopefully Dr. Michelson is dialed in and can hear us and start some remarks here.
Welcome everyone to part one of Connecting California. This is ironic. I'm actually in the San Joaquin Valley of California in a little town called Arvin, and there is no internet. So anyway, if the collective knowledge of the people on this panel has not proven sufficient to have already solved the problem of the digital divide, then we should surmise that the answer will surely require something more. But let's back up. Nearly a century ago, FDR said that electricity should no longer be considered a luxury, but rather a necessity. Today, the same should be said for broadband. Most of us here today have been concerned with this issue for quite some time. But it is the COVID crisis that has made this moment most urgent. To put a point on it, broadband is a sine qua non for remote learning, essential for many who cannot work from home to do so, for those who are not working to find a job, and for some, it is the only means of social contact. The FCC reported that almost 1/2 of low-income households of people of color lacked broadband internet service. So what should we do? Austin Buettner, who I respect greatly, just had published an op-ed in which he advocated for a new tax on the haves to pay for the have-nots. So if you heard a lot of joyful clapping and celebrating yesterday, well, that was the broadband sellers who are more than happy with having more money coming their way. Maybe philanthropy is the answer. In some cities, money has been raised to provide broadband access to everyone. And my own foundation has paid to have tens of thousands of computers refurbished and distributed. But does that really scale in a state of 34 million people? So what should we do? Let's start with the realization that while the various broadband providers appear to compete, they are actually allied in their desire to maximize their own profits. That notwithstanding, I do not believe that the state should be entreating them for relief, running around with a tin cup in hand. We are honored this morning to have Londe with us, and perhaps she will share with you just how well that has actually gone. But I have a rather modest proposal. I believe the state of California should issue an RFP. That is a request for proposal to provide low-cost broadband service to every single person in California. It would be a reverse bidding process, winner take all, and everybody else would get shut out. That would actually have the providers competing against each other and might attract a socially conscious visionary doer, such as an Elon Musk or Richard Branson, maybe a Tom Steyer or Michael Bloomberg, to jump into the game. It is the job of government to do for its citizens collectively what they cannot do as individuals. I believe that now is the time for our government, the state of California, to act boldly. Thank you. Please enjoy the rest of the conference.
Great, thank you, Dr. Michelson. I'd like to hand things over to Dr. Londe Jose, the Senior Policy Advisor for Higher Education for Governor Newsom, one of the leading voices on this issue in California and really the tip of the spear on this issue. So Londe, please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining and for having us. I'm delighted to be with you here today. And I really appreciate Dr. Michelson's comments about the urgency with which we need to really get about trying to solve what has been a persistent digital divide in California for well over a decade, for really the last couple of decades. In my role in the administration, I'm actually responsible for higher education policy, and I like to say, and other duties as assigned. And I was honored, actually, when I was asked to be able to help support the governor's task force on jobs in the economy in terms of staffing it as they thought about what are the types of priorities that California really needed to take up in order to get the economy back on track and on solid footing in light of the global pandemic that we're all facing right now. As we do that, as they did that work, they started to surface what were their own priorities, and certainly Governor Newsom has had a longstanding set of priorities. Amongst them has been how to close the digital divide. In many ways, one of the outcomes of the pandemic, one of the silver linings, if you will, or opportunities to be leveraged, is to take this crisis and to use it as the mechanism for really thinking about how do we ensure connectivity for every California household. And so that is what the task force decided to set up as its goal and its priority. It's one of many priorities, but that is one of the driving focuses right now of their work. Even more important, a couple of weeks ago, when the administration announced that, in fact, as a result of the pandemic, a number of schools would be opening in distance learning mode, the need became even more acute. And so right now we have put ourselves on a fairly short time clock to try and figure out how do we ensure that every California school child has connectivity to be able to have their education in the next, over the next year. So that strategy, that approach really is a four-part approach that the task force is leading. And I want to tell you a little bit about that approach, and then, I'm happy later on to answer any questions. The first really has to do with internet service. We recognize that there are millions of Californians and across the state who do not have internet service. Oftentimes the digital divide is thought of as being, like Dr. Michelson, perhaps you're in a rural area and you can't get access, but it's not just rural areas. There are certainly a lot of connectivity deserts in our cities, and we want to ensure that no matter where you are in the state of California, that household has internet service. And so in that light, we have been having conversations with the internet service providers about being more aggressive in letting people know about the range of services, and particularly the low cost services that they offer, so that every household can have connectivity. I appreciate Dr. Michelson's recommendation to think about this reverse RFP, and I'll make sure to take it back to Tom Steyer, who is one of the co-chairs of the task force. So we've been focusing really on working with those internet service providers and trying to get them to be aligned, whether you're a cable or a telco, to really think about what it is that needs to be offered to families, and how do we think about best-in-class service for those families, that it's not simply good enough to have access if you don't have appropriate bandwidth and you're not able to have that access guaranteed. So we're really focusing on that. The second piece of our strategy is looking at devices in particular, and this is a focus on school children. We have estimates that California children need anywhere between 700,000 and 1 million devices in order to be connected during the school year. And so we are in an all-out effort to really try and ensure that we are able to scale those devices. We're working with a number of manufacturers, including a deal that was announced yesterday by the Superintendent of Public Instruction. That will be a deal with Apple to really try and scale their devices. I think it's Apple and T-Mobile who will be doing that effort. And they're going to be able to provide about 100,000 devices in the next 4 to 6 weeks to school children. In our budget this year, we allocated $5.3 billion to address learning loss and the ways in which California school children, because of the pandemic, were not able to return to their classrooms, and wanting to make sure that we're able to mitigate any of that learning loss. Some of those resources are specifically allocated for devices, and so we do have the resources set aside to be able to work with manufacturers around devices. We're also looking at other manufacturers. We're having conversations with Google. We're looking at Chromebooks. We have some deals with some third-party vendors, and we're also looking very deeply at the possibilities for refurbishing. Although we have heard from a number of schools that in the process of refurbishing, those have to be really high quality devices that schools don't need more e-waste. So we're really trying to figure out what are all the significant sources of devices. Our third strategy is really about public awareness. And I think for many families, we want them to recognize the importance of having internet service. That is not just for school, though school is kind of the tip of the spear and is most significant, as we said, in the next 4 to 6 weeks. But what it's also important for is that the pandemic has shown, as Dr. Michelson said, that there is a huge divide in terms of the haves and the have-nots. What it has shown is that increasingly, if you want to look for a job, you need access to the internet. What we've learned through the pandemic is if you want to have access to healthcare, telehealth is now scaling at rates that we never thought we'd seen, that would have taken 10 years, and we've seen it happen over 3 or 4 months. Just all kinds of focus on connectivity, working from home, that all requires internet service. And what we also know about California is that we are a state that is not, we are familiar with crises, whether it is a pandemic, a forest fire, a flood. We have many crises in the state, and really having internet access is a part of a resiliency strategy that the state government wants to make sure every family has. And then our fourth priority really is, and I want to give credit to Phil Kim for helping me to think about this, is really about utilization and support. That it is not enough to simply provide a family with a device, a hotspot, internet access, and say, go for it. People have to understand and know how to use those tools that are in their home. And so we are also focused on thinking about how do we build and scale the kinds of supports, particularly those that are culturally competent, to help people figure out how to use the tools that are in their home, to figure out how to stay connected, stay in communities because of the new access that they may have. So those are the 4 priorities that the task force is looking at: infrastructure and ISP access, devices, public awareness, and finally, support. And with that, I will pass the baton.
Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Siever. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and I'm super excited to be with you all today. Lunde, thank you. The work that you're doing in the government, Dr. Michelson, thank you. The work that you guys are doing with the foundation, it is all incredible. And I am super excited to see this cohesive effort that addresses all the different aspects of the digital divide. Unfortunately, there are a lot of well-meaning efforts out there that only address connectivity, or only address devices, or only address the digital literacy. But what we're talking about today is all of those things, recognizing that we have to have all of those things. So we're gonna get started with, Jean is gonna kick us off with a discussion of why there are digital divides in the first place.
Thank you very much. So I'm the Chief Data Officer at the City of Los Angeles, and a lot of my work is involved in helping get people connected and making sure that that connectivity is equitable. The reason that we kind of are in this situation that we just heard about, where people are really at risk if they don't have digital access, if they're not connected, if they're not online, they also aren't eligible to do jobs at telework. And so in a COVID situation, they also have to put themselves out into the workplace, into the physical workplace, and increase their risk of contracting the disease. So I don't mean to sound dramatic, but it has become a matter of life and death. So why do we get to here in the first place? Well, part of it is the same way that we got to redlining in the 1940s and 50s around affordable housing in California and throughout the country. So it's really digital redlining. And I'm not going to assert that somebody was intentional in all of this, other than to say that the people who build the infrastructure and the ability for us to connect are driven by different things than some of us might be. So companies are often driven by profit, almost always driven by profit. And those companies built out their networks to reach the people who would pay the top dollar in order to be able to get connected. It's not as if we're asking them to do something that we didn't understand. But the problem is that the rest of us let them do that. So living in a municipal government, it's really important, I think, for us in Los Angeles and for others to understand that we have a role in fixing this. And 5G has given us this opportunity to take a place where we let things just happen in an ungoverned way. We wouldn't have let this happen with pollution in our rivers and streams. We wouldn't have let, inequity happen in a more visible way. But we've let this digital divide occur in a way that has manifestly changed the ability for people to get to school, to get educated, to have a future, to get job training, to have access to wealth and opportunity in a fundamental way that I would challenge is even more important than having access to electricity. So when we think about this, we need to, one, acknowledge that there is a digital divide, acknowledge what got us there, which is really this ability for companies to do the work that they do, but in an ungoverned way, where we didn't put the idea of equity, racial equity, issues of alleviating poverty as part of the value system that those companies needed. Several municipal governments have tried to build municipal broadband. They're almost all a net revenue loss for those cities. And so as we think towards how we can alleviate this, we need to start thinking about changing all of the value systems towards ones which enforce and ensure that we're building a more equitable future. And we don't have to wait long. We can do it right now. We can start today. In Los Angeles, we started 2 years ago when we first deployed 5G, and we did it by sharing our broadband connectivity data for our neighborhood levels with the companies and said, we're going to permit fast, but we're going to permit based on equity. So you need to build out across the city in a way that helps build up the neighborhoods who were left behind before faster than you're building out to the neighborhoods that are going to be able to pay your top dollar. So I think we really have to acknowledge that, figure out the way to move forward, and make sure that we don't leave anyone behind.
Super, thanks, Jean. Can I turn real quick to Devin to talk about the digital divide? So Jean talked to us about the digital divide that exists in terms of the connectivity that's available. Devin, can you talk about the digital divide that exists in terms of digital literacy skills?
Sure. And good morning, everyone. And thank you all for having me today. And a particular thank you for Dr. Michelson and the Michelson Foundation for having me this morning. So before I jump into that, I just want to introduce myself. So my name is Devin Miner. I'm a state network manager with the National Skills Coalition, or NSC. NSC is a 20-year-old nonprofit organization based in DC, whose mission is to make sure that every worker in every industry have the skills to compete and prosper. We work with workforce development and business leaders across the nation to inform and advance policies at the state and federal level. As a Los Angeles native and resident, I have the privilege of working with nonprofit training worker centers, labor, local boards, CBOs, and community colleges to advance some of the work of NSC in California. NSC's work in California, which under the banner of our Skills for California network, is made possible with funders that include the James Irvine Foundation, Tippers Point Community, and Balmer Group. So definitely want to acknowledge the investments from those organizations. And so going back to your question, Angela, the reason that the digital divide exists, continues to exist, is because of it's a host of factors that we can look at, but it's definitely structural factors that we have to explore, and longstanding structural factors that we have to explore as we think about why the digital divide still exists. And so when you think about the way our education system is set up, our K-12 system, and looking at the individuals who have quality K-12 experiences and those don't, you also have to think about income and wealth gap that exists. And so we have to think about the longstanding structural components that have existed, that have contributed to the digital divide to continue and to maintain in our society today.
Thank you, Devin. Jessica, can you talk to us about the cost barrier and how the cost of things influences the digital divides?
Absolutely. And first, let me say I'm so glad to be with you all today and really appreciate the opportunity to come together about this really important and very urgent conversation. So thank you to the Michelson Foundation team and the founders. the cost, as those of us who are literally joining with screens right now, varies widely. And it certainly is something we've learned a lot about in the last several months, because we've seen not only the cost differentiation in terms of what the capabilities of devices and the strength of connectivity can look like, but also because that cost is something that must consistently be monitored in terms of whether it's actually serving your needs. So we may think about whether a device has a certain amount of memory, whether you may have a certain amount of bandwidth to participate in the digital world. Is that actually going to allow you to do what your art teacher is hoping to do in an interactive way in your classroom? That can be a no, even if we technically on paper know that you are connected. Similarly, devices really also need to be accessible in terms of their usage. And I'm sure you all are familiar with the fact that they go up in price as they have additional features, such as touchscreens, such as being you can fold them in more than just 90-degree angle. There are a lot of different aspects that actually make devices better for learning, more accessible for different types of learners, but also just make them more expensive. So we have been trying to think a lot about how to, I think as Lande mentioned before, best in service. What does best in service mean in terms of pricing? People should not just get the cheapest items, although the industries have done an incredible job making things, helping you get more bang for your buck that you're investing. But at the same time, if we're truly going to invest, especially in this case, in our case, in the education system and the impact that students and teachers can have in using devices and connectivity, it needs to be sufficient, and that's not cheap.
Thank you, Jessica. Bernie, can you talk to us about why these digital divides are persisting and what are some policy changes that we can make at the state and federal level to influence those?
Certainly, and just to provide some background a little bit about who the Electronic Frontier Foundation is in this space, I've been our lead researcher on this kind of fundamental question of what the 21st century internet access looks like and how do we avoid the mistakes of the past, which we're living with right now. And it really stems back to understanding the history of how we got here. So if you think about 15 years ago, it's kind of when the first decisions were made about walking away from what historically has been how we treated telecom, which is if you're going to build in this community, build in this city, you have to cover everyone. That's why lots of people have telephone lines. That's why lots of people have cable lines. Historically, the government has been very involved in saying you cannot pick winners and losers in which neighborhoods get covered. But in 2005 and onwards, states and the federal government, primarily through the FCC, walked away from this idea on the premise that telecoms would compete with cable and fiber to the home would be regressively deployed as a means of competing with high-speed cable entities. And fast forward to today, we've seen what happened. Fiber infrastructure, and I really want to emphasize this, it's the universal medium that is dividing 21st century access to legacy access, and it has been deployed in a very discriminatory way. If you look at all the federal data, it shows that the top half of the income scale have high-speed access. They have cheap internet. They have internet that's going to upgrade for decades to come. And if you're on the low-income side, or if you're on the rural side, they haven't deployed this type of infrastructure out there, which has left people with whatever best you can do with the legacy infrastructure that's there, which is copper wires, cable, coaxial cable lines, maybe satellite, maybe some low-speed wireless. That is what is left there until policy recognizes the infrastructure discrepancy through fiber. Now, the solution, right, is to get our infrastructure policy oriented around this. President Michelson mentioned this idea of the state opening an RFP for affordable broadband. I think that's 90% of the way there. What we should be thinking about is, to the extent that fiber infrastructure is the thing that launches all services, 5G, cloud computing, high speed, any sort of high capacity services well into the future, an estimated 70 plus years from now. The concept of the state building the roads of the internet into areas that are lacking it. This is much what the New York City is talking about right now in terms of resolving their digital divide in terms of the low income neighborhoods. I think that's a central role. And I think it's a combination of, kind of this infrastructure policy planning, which, many other countries are way ahead of us, have been doing for a long time. Folks have wondered why South Korea is so dominant in the broadband space. I'll tell you, the short answer of it is 30 to 40 years of infrastructure planning. consistent government involvement in pushing out, next generation networks and kind of a goal always set to that. And I think the last thing I really want to emphasize too, as we think about how do we solve the digital divide, we also have to think about who's going to be the builders of that resolution. And I am here to tell you, if your hope is pinned on the big national carriers, stop hoping, because they're driven by very different motivations than small private entities and local governments, and their drive is purely around quarterly reporting, profits, dividends, lots of things that push really hard against the idea of long-term investments into areas that will take a significant amount of effort to cultivate and bring into the 21st century in an effective way. 10-year plus plans, these are not the things that major nationals will entertain. It's not, and you cannot give them infinite carrots to resolve that. But that doesn't mean we're helpless.
Ernie, we keep hearing that 5G is going to solve this all. It's this magical solution that's going to come in and then everybody's going to have internet. What do you think about that?
So the 5G cannot so a 5G network, here's the thing they don't mention. A 5G network is about 99% fiber. And so to the extent that where you're seeing 5G deployments now, it's almost always leveraging existing fiber deployments, which are already in, the upper half of the income scale, business sector, downtown. Pushing it out further will require not have complete reliance on the AT&T Verizons, if you will, to build that fiber. They're going to need, they themselves will need to cooperate and synergize with other efforts from local private and local governments as well. Because it is just cost prohibitive, the idea of building a bunch of redundancy in these types of infrastructure. So 5G can't really solve anything until we get the infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure that enables 5G solved.
Super, thanks, Ernie. Jessica, let's just nail down the divides again real quick, and then we'll get into some more solutions. Why is it different, city to city, county to county, state to state?
Let me first say that in a lot of places, it doesn't differ city to city, county to county, to state. The places we have underinvested with our public dollars continue to reflect that underinvestment, as Ernie mentioned, in terms of the legacy infrastructure versus opportunities and the ways that our public and private sectors have or have not invested. What I will say is that things differ a lot, of course, because of local industries. The fact that we are lucky to have so many tech companies and a lot of other business headquarters here in California has been a boon in a lot of ways, but shouldn't have been a boon more given how many are here. But I will say, I do think California is an incredible lab to think about how we may think about elsewhere in the nation. We actually have so many different kinds of localities, so many different people, backgrounds, and situations going on just in the state of California, that if we think about how to map that elsewhere, there are a lot of solutions that we need to think through. But I will say that right now we're seeing a lot of change and difference simply based on leadership prioritizing this. So for those who have leadership who understand the legacy issues and who know that this is an incredibly important equity issue for communities, as was mentioned earlier, for things even like telehealth, applying to jobs, what it means for a working parent to be able to have the flexibility to work from home is hugely different in terms of the experience for the entire rest of the family. So that kind of unevenness is very common, unfortunately, but is finally the awareness around it is being seen. But I will say that so much of this does map with other inequities that we find in public utilities and other aspects, whether it's violence, the income that you find in concentrations in different cities and other counties and states. And so what we need to look at there is how all of these things are connected, and pretty much in terms of the digital divide are preventing people from benefiting from anything else that they might get in terms of civil services.
In the health industry, they talk about social determinants of health, and that connectivity has been defined as a super social determinant of health. So your housing, your work, your education. I think that applies beyond, just as Jessica said, it applies beyond just health, right? Connectivity influences everything that we do. And so going over to the solutions and leaders, Jean, our solution leader on the panel, can you tell us about the solutions that LA is working on?
Sure, of course. And we started this process some time ago. So 4 years ago, we formed a connectivity and digital inclusion working group. So that was inside the city. But we realized, kind of to what Ernesto was saying, that there was a lot of infrastructure that we weren't governing, that there was a lot of building going around the city that while we were permitting, because in California, you have to allow the telecommunications companies to be able to come in and build, and you can control some of that from the municipal level. We were just permitting it like it was anything else, not as if it were this utility that we need. So in talking to the telecommunication companies, trying to see what would motivate them to build towards equity, we realized that we needed to make things faster and affordable for them. So we focused on the first of those two things. Because the faster they build their network equitably, the better it is for Los Angeles, because more people get connected. And so we first focused on escalating our internal procedures, and we were able to move things and improve it by 3,000% in speed of permitting. 3,000. So that was a lot of things that we changed internally. Secondarily, what we did is we really thought about things, you'll love this, as California. So CAL is our mantra: connectivity, accessibility, and literacy. So we always made sure that those three things were part and parcel. It's no good if we just build out fiber if we're not also building out the ability for people to get access to devices that are useful, not just like, your sister's phone to write your term paper on, but something that puts you towards a par with everybody else. And then the digital literacy to go safely online and to be able to get access to the services that you need. So as we did that, we also looked at the fact that 5G gave us this opportunity. And 5G is not the only technology. I mean, Starlink's constellation is already up and running. We're getting beamed internet, startups beaming off the mountains around Los Angeles. There's a lot of other technologies, but 5G meant that we were putting 10,000 more devices in our infrastructure, and these small cells meant that we had an opportunity, like a transformational opportunity to get those devices put into communities that had been left behind before. So we look at 5G as not like the savior, but the opportunity to be able to say, people are going to build out more. Let's get them to build out in South LA and Watts. And then finally, the way that we look at this is we now have a forum that we meet on a regular basis with all of the telecommunication providers. And we focus half of our time on the things that are sort of logistics and building out the networks. And we spend the other half of the time talking about the focus priorities on equity for the city. So obviously these last two meetings, and it's all of the telecommunication providers, including the infrastructure providers like Crown Castle. And so all of these folks together, we talk a lot about LAUSD and getting our students connected for the coming school year and how we're working towards that. So we really focus on those pieces. And the last piece that we're doing, I think that is also transformational, and we're looking for partners on this, is the ability to create entrepreneurs who've grown up in the digital divide, who are going to completely disrupt and destroy the digital divide. So we all have some ideas, but there's a lot of great ideas out there. So we're building a new South LA incubator called the Vision Lab in South LA that's going to focus on incubating entrepreneurs from the community there that are going to help disrupt this, and then have a training center to help bring folks who are in one sector into these forward-facing sectors with commitments from telecommunication companies and others to hire folks as they're building these new networks.
That's awesome, Jean. I love CAL. That's very creative. Can you tell us more about the L part, the digital literacy piece of it?
Yeah, so digital literacy is a piece that we work in coordination with education and community-based organizations. We have a few city departments, like we have the LA Cyber Lab, and that works with small businesses and individuals to help them learn how to be cyber safe. And we do digital and data literacy courses through our neighborhood councils out to all of our communities in multiple languages to be able to give them access to, like, how do I get online to services? What are we doing? And how am I able to get to be able to do that? But we really find that where people trust a lot of folks in the community, surprisingly, it's not always government, is faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, and schools. And so we have the largest community college system in the country, LA Community College District, which has been a huge partner, UCLA, USC. We have a huge consortium of universities. And what we do is we make sure, and then workforce training and development centers. And we make sure that all of these folks have access to the materials and support and services from the city government that will help them succeed, whether those are grants to run programs, publicity to get people into the programs, or opening up new data and information that they might need.
Super, thank you. And those who are joining us online, if you could add your questions to the Q&A section, we'll definitely get to as many questions as we can. Devin, I'd like to turn to you. And National Skills Coalition has released some reports recently that have just, for NDIA, have been incredibly helpful. We love the work of the National Skills Coalition. So can you talk some about the analysis that National Skills Coalition has done around the readiness of our workforce for these jobs that require digital skills?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that, Angela. Yeah, and to your point, NSC has done a lot of research around, you know, the connection between digital literacy and just being successful in the workforce. And so the connection that we see here, we like to look at it in a three-legged stool, as we like to refer to it at NSC. And so there's a strong connection. So even before the pandemic, it was apparent that American jobs were undergoing massive technological transformation. So in-demand careers are increasingly requiring digital skills, and for many industries, skills are entry-level competencies for new and existing workers. So it's important to acknowledge that, you know, there was a skills and digital gap well before the pandemic. The pandemic has only accelerated digital demands in the U.S. workforce, and almost every workforce is being asked to quickly adjust. We work with organizations across the nation and across the state. And in March, when the pandemic hit, you know, a lot of organizations spoke to how they had to deliver their service delivery and trainings online. And so while a digital gap exists across every demographic group, you know, workers and people of color have been disproportionately impacted. And so going back to that three-legged stool that I referred to, and Londe kind of touched on this earlier in her opening remarks, there's three legs to it. And we like to, the three legs are broadband, so having access to reliable sources, to, you know, access the internet, much of what my colleagues on this panel have discussed already. The second leg of the stool is devices and equipment. So make sure you have access to desktops, laptops, and other devices that will allow one to succeed in the educational or work environment that requires digital engagement. And one of our case studies, we found that families are, you know, sometimes sharing one laptop to complete related schoolwork and related work tasks. And so we have to think about, you know, what families are experiencing. And then I saw this come up in the chat as well, but we also found that some families are using Chromebooks that were provided from their children's school. And now that school is over, you know, folks don't have access to a reliable laptop. And it's also important to acknowledge that Chromebooks sometimes, you know, have preventions around the websites and stuff that you can access, so that prevents people from completing some tasks. Excuse me. And so, again, we also found that, you know, and now that we're living in a pandemic, that some folks are actually losing their jobs because they can't complete their COVID-19 training because they don't have access to these devices. So, you know, devices and equipment is critical to our workforce and the success of our workforce. And the third leg of the stool is, you know, just the ability to operate the computer and software programs, and that being critical to one's success in school and in the workplace. So, again, like people of color are more likely to lack broadband internet access at home and face greater difficulties obtaining the technology often used to build literacy skills. And so now more than ever is, you know, we need to invest in these three legs of the stool. So that being broadband, devices, and equipment, and skills.
That's super, Devin, thanks. Jessica, can you talk to us a bit about the role of philanthropy in all of this? So we've talked about the barriers that are out there. We know the solutions are occurring with government and with community-based organizations. What's the role of philanthropy?
Happy to. Let me first say that we at the CDA Foundation are a small but mighty team that really sits in the world between public and private and helps philanthropy invest directly in the system itself, which isn't always how it's done necessarily. I think what's really important for philanthropy to think about here is what skill sets they are bringing to the table that can complement things in the near term, especially as we are building out our longer term goals in addressing the digital divide. And by that, I mean, philanthropy can often be more nimble with their funding or even just their actions. They can come together and think through from different perspectives in different geographic locations, how they might address a plan that is both broad-based as well as rooted in local need and local control and local knowledge. They also often are more willing and able to invest in essentially what is a startup incubator type opportunity, whether it's recognizing really wonderful grassroots efforts in South LA, as Jean mentioned, and seeing what kind of opportunity is there. That isn't always something that is as available, especially right away, to our public entities to think about. It's often quite risky, but it's a risk we need to take. And it's only risky if we think that the way things are now are as they should continue. So I think it's really important for philanthropy to think about the opportunity. I also want to add really quickly that I think in terms of where philanthropy in the landscape of investing in anything right now can make some of the biggest difference. I really do think the digital divide is a place to focus, especially right now. We, of course, work in the education sector, but we've already heard just today so far how many different places it impacts. You literally are switching on opportunity when you're closing the digital divide. With every step of providing devices, connectivity, support, you're giving people a way to engage in life as we know it now. So if we don't provide that, we're essentially saying you can't engage in any of the world that is growing, that is where opportunity, income levels, and all of that can increase for you. So I could elaborate further, of course, but I just really want to stress that philanthropy should look at this as a place, no matter what their institutional strategies have been, that actually is a place to focus on communities, and especially to think through structures of oppression that have really kept opportunities from engaging, from being offered to communities, let alone the fact that those communities should be leading our work. If we think about what our demographics of our young people look like right now, how digital natives they are, and how much actually they should be telling us the future of the digital world should look like, that's where we need to focus our funds.
Thank you, Jessica. Ernie, can you talk to us a bit about the role philanthropy could play in influencing state policy, federal policy?
Certainly, and I think it's really important to understand. There's the immediate solution, the immediate crisis, and then there's like the permanent solution into the future. Because I'm going to be the bearer of bad news. There is zero ways to give people high-speed internet in a very short window unless the existing infrastructure, which is fiber, is already there. And 15 years of neglect will not be overwritten in a 3 to 6 month concentrated period of time, right? It's going to be a multi-year effort to bring us back to a point of equality of access, because it's really baked into the physics. The wires and the infrastructure of the legacy networks just cannot get faster than what they have now. So if you have neighbors and if you have friends and folks who are saying, I have internet, but I can't even do the Zoom classroom, or I can't even do remote work. They don't seem to have an option to just go to the ISP and say, can you give me a faster service? They physically can't do it unless they've upgraded and began to roll out an integration of fiber infrastructure. This is why the cable networks mostly are high speed, because they've basically put fiber throughout their whole lines, with some exceptions. But this is also why your DSL lines and your slow wireless out there are going to be what they are, with little transition. So I think the immediate answer right now is helping people pay for their broadband bills as they exist to keep them online, right? AFF supports kind of the emergency measures that are happening in DC of simply, let's just get people free internet. If they don't have the income right now, let's just make sure they keep connected for free. Wi-Fi hotspots and things like that. But those are the reliance on the existing towers that exist to extend their signals. I mean, these are the immediate measures you can do. This is similar to when there's like a disaster of sorts. Carriers have ways to deploy mobile wireless technology to extend temporarily signals to areas that have lack of coverage, right? These are kind of the emergency options you have in a very short window of time. As we get through this crisis, though, and we think about the future, I really want everyone to understand one really critical piece about COVID-19 and the shift of increase of internet usage. It's only increased by maybe at most 40 to 50% in terms of the usage that people do. That is basically what the internet would have looked like in a few years anyway. And so to the extent that we are seeing these crisis connection issues and people are unable to make full use of the internet, that's the future, not too distant timeline right now when the pandemic ends. And if we can start working on connecting everyone to high-speed 21st century ready access, which is a long-term infrastructure plan, 5 to 10 years of work, we will never have to talk about this issue in the present, right? It will be a historical note, much like water, electricity, and the roads. And that's what I really want to emphasize for folks is there is a short-term emergency response, but there's also a very long, sustained effort. And I guess the last note to that is remember the legacy infrastructure providers that exist out there, which is all these major nationals. They're not interested in the transition because they may not be the ones that sell the service, right? And so there's going to be a whole ton of resistance as well to solving this issue.
Ernie, I really love the framing it as we would have ended up here in a couple of years in terms of usage, because I haven't heard it framed like that before, and I think that is spot on. It just moved things up a bit. It changed how we live, right? So the idea that you have multiple people in a household now needing to be on video, that increases our need for it, not just that we're all at home, but how we're using it is actually changed. There was a question in the chat from Kelly about short-term and long-term solutions, and Ernie just addressed the connectivity in terms of short-term. We got to pay for people's internet. We got to set up wireless networks, things that can be done in a matter of months. And then there's the long-term, which is changing policy and building fiber networks to really get the connectivity that will last folks and meet their full needs. Devin, can you talk about the digital literacy and device part of it that is the short-term, long-term?
Sure. So I think even before we address like the short-term and long-term, I just want to emphasize the importance of just having those foundational skills, right? And the importance of investing in spaces where young people and young adults and workers can develop those foundational skills. And when I say foundational skills, I mean like before we can all log into Zoom and be on this call, before we can send emails, before we can construct sentences and paragraphs on Microsoft Word, those foundational skills are being able to turn on and off your computer, is being able to use the mouse and highlight text and being able to distinguish between a right click and a left click. It's being able to scroll up and down. It's being able to click on icons that allow you to access different applications and tools. And so it's important that we look at foundational skills as an important component of it. And I think short term, as we look into like the role of devices, I think looking at it from a workforce development perspective, the role of sector partnerships comes into hand. And I know that the governor and Secretary Sue and all of our leadership at California have been at the forefront of making sure that we have structures in place that will allow folks to have access to these quality devices that will allow them to succeed in the workplace and also like in school.
Super, thanks, Devin. Jean, getting to the short-term solutions question, there's Anne asked a question in the chat about the short-term solutions, particularly with schools starting up. Can you talk about public spaces to use Wi-Fi? So I personally have a soapbox where I'm like, in an urban area, people need to have it in their homes. Don't tell the kids to go to a parking lot. But I also recognize sometimes that's like the last resort, and that's really where some folks end up. That's really their only option. So can you talk about those solutions and the paying for internet solution, the Wi-Fi solutions in LA County?
Sure, no problem. And I think we have to just be a little bit realistic, right? So if kids don't have devices to connect with, they're going to be walking up to some. I'm just going to pick on one solution, which is school buses with Wi-Fi, and have them drive around randomly to neighborhoods and park for a while. Like, I'm not really sure how a fourth grader is supposed to then take their computer, which is not necessarily a laptop, out next to the bus and do their homework in the parking lot in August in Los Angeles, where it's going to be over 105 degrees. So I think, like you said, Angela, we have to be more realistic, and it's overly complicated by the fact that we have COVID. So the kinds of places that we normally provide students spots we have to think about that differently. So we are not finalized, but we are working to figure out how we can do that safely in our parks, which are outdoor spaces, but could be brought. We could bring the Wi-Fi out to the parks, and in fact, just this last 6 months, we've electrified and brought up free internet at many of our parks because they became emergency homeless shelters. And so as we're moving those people into hotel rooms now, and so we're kind of bringing the rec and parks back to actual parks, we now have this infrastructure we've been building, kind of to what Devin was saying, necessity is the mother of invention in this case, that we really are able to think about how can we use open spaces where there's less COVID risk, as well as indoor spaces where we can socially distance. And our libraries are part of this as well, because the libraries are already outfitted and part of it. We just have to figure out how to do this in a way that's safe. The other thing is that we have had a large effort in coordination with LA Unified School District in making sure that we can get kids, again, the connectivity, the accessibility and devices, and the infrastructure and literacy that they need. And to Ernesto's point, I feel blessed that we saw this coming 4 years ago, not COVID, but the connection issues. And so we focused first on making sure that every single geographic spot in LA City was connected, and then secondarily that they were connected with at least 2 providers. So we have almost no dead spots. I mean, there's some oddities, and we're doing some special work around some public housing areas right now. But once you have that infrastructure, you can make things happen a lot faster. And then I think you just need to be very creative on the near term on, cellular hotspots are helpful in some cases. If you're lucky to be in an area in the northern states, then eventually Elon Musk and Starlink are going to hit you shortly, actually very shortly. There's other specific things you can build. So while you need to trench up your streets and build fiber, not all of it needs to be done that way. You can try to work with the telecommunication companies to find creative solutions.
Jean, I have a vague memory that that LA is one of the cities that negotiated with the providers to cover some of the cost of internet for low-income families. Is that accurate?
We created a program called Get Connected Los Angeles, and it's a website, Get Connected Los Angeles at lacity.org, and it actually is in partnership with the California Emerging Technologies Fund, so everyone on, and so anyone can put. It's not just for LA, although I think some of the offers might be for LA, but it's true for anybody in the country. And you can go to that site, put in your zip code, and find out what the low-cost options are for you, especially if you're a part of SNAP, or you have a K-12 student in the house, or you have a senior or a veteran. There's different kinds of offers for different demographics. But it's a really quick way to find the cheapest device to buy. So it's both devices and connectivity. And the connectivity, and then some of those connection options are free, depending on kind of which programs you qualify for. And then we've been able to work hard with the companies to negotiate down so that for a lot of folks, there aren't any. So for AT&T, for example, they have $10 a month with no data caps. And we know that kids who are expected to zoom in for 3 hours to 4 hours a day and do their homework, and there will be other times they're online, that they need 40 gigs a month, right? So these little data caps aren't going to cut it at all.
So and that's a wireless solution, Jean? That's not a wireline?
That's a wireless solution.
Okay. That's super. For everyone on is a website where you can see what the discount offers are that consumers can use. And through CETF, there's a specific one for California, which is really fabulous because then that can narrow down. Then you're not seeing things from all over that don't apply to you. Those are for the consumer to go look at and see what's available. For the organizations who are doing the support, NDIA on our website, digitalinclusion.org, we have a list of the free and low cost offers. So that's more on the support side of it, not direct to consumer. There are also places that are negotiating with the providers and paying directly. I kind of think of it as bulk purchasing. So school districts are doing this, local governments are doing this, sometimes foundations, sometimes corporations are coming together and paying ahead of time to that internet service provider. And then those families are identified as who will then have access to the service that's been paid for by somebody else. So I put in the chat, we have a list of who's doing great digital equity work and at the local level. So you can see some of those there. So we have another question in the Q&A from Anne about, oh, I think we already answered that one. Sorry. So can we get to the issue of the focus on school kids? We all definitely want to address the needs of the school kids, but then the fact that they live in families. This is another soapbox I have. Kids don't live alone. So we can't just help the kids. Devin, can you talk a bit about the support needed for the whole family?
Sure. So being able to not only work in California, but across 20 other states, one thing we saw that there's a need for a two-gen approach now that folks are working from home and schooling from home more than they have in the past. And so, it's important that we see that that workers. Sorry, Angela, could you repeat the question? I lost my train of thought.
No, it's okay. The fact that there's all this focus on school kids, so the solutions that are out there that address the whole family.
Yeah. So the solutions, it goes back to the 3 points that I made earlier, just making sure that households are set up to where, one, they have adequate devices, so devices for both folks who are working in the house and students who are in school. It's making sure that there's a reliable connection available for those families to take advantage of. And then also making sure that, folks are properly equipped with the skills, to work in a now, super remote world. And so working with NSC, we found that, over 48 million workers across the nation lack the foundational skills, that I spoke to earlier. And so if we have both an adult and children in the household, and, now adults are expected to help their children more so in the classroom, it's kind of burdening when they don't necessarily know how to, navigate a computer or navigate different software. So it's important that we make sure that we're investing on both sides, both the youth and the adults, so that, now that we are working remote, that people are properly set up to succeed in these remote environments.
Okay, thanks, Devin. Hey, Ernie, there was a question in the chat asking about Wi-Fi through bus stations and trolley stations. Can you address that one for us?
Yeah, so, can you get Wi-Fi in certain areas? I mean, it really comes down to, thinking about where your resource of the internet, if you will, right? Like, where is the highest capacity connection to the internet located, and how far can you stretch that with the existing hardware? So Wi-Fi will depend on a lot of line of sight, basically from if you can connect from one point to another and have a clear line of sight, you can kind of keep extending it out there. But there's also, I think there's a real aggressive role that local governments are playing right now of looking at what assets they have that could serve as like that anchor point to enable the Wi-Fi. So, I know the San Francisco story pretty well. The BART system, our mass transit system, it has fiber running along the rails in all directions. A lot of small private and local entities just basically pay for access to the capacity of that infrastructure to move the information from point A to point B. I wouldn't be surprised if Caltrans and other government entities who built infrastructure to support communications needs of other needs could be extended or opened up to allow things like Wi-Fi in areas that don't have it right now as like the emergency response. Again, it comes down to, do you have the infrastructure in the ground now? And if you do, there's lots of ways you can repurpose it to help solve the immediate need with a longer plan afterwards.
Super, thanks, Ernie. There was a note in the Q&A that Sherry's concerned with the statement that schools have a perception that refurbished computers cannot be of high quality or are thought of as e-waste. So I completely agree with Sherry. A lot of the solutions out there are actually refurbished. in part because you can get really quality machines that way, but also there's a shortage of computers. Go try to buy a Chromebook. See what happens. You can't, right? They're not there anymore. The supply is depleted. Folks are being told it's going to be months. My kid's school district, we're told latest is November. If we're lucky, we might have them in October. So there's a shortage of devices. And so not only is it that they are a solution to the shortage of new devices, but they can actually be quality depending upon where they come from. Sherry's organization is one where we know it's quality. And so it's super important to view those refurbishers as partners. And in some places we are seeing those refurbishers partner with these community-wide coalitions where then the corporations get involved. A great example from Cleveland, couple corporations there now have bought out their own computers leases and are getting their computers that were going to be sent back to be refurbished for whatever purposes in some third location, but now to stay in their town, to stay in Cleveland, to be refurbished and to go into people's homes. I'm also going to put in the chat, NDIA is a network of community-based organizations like Sherry's that either refurbish computers or provide the digital literacy training or help folks get signed up for discount internet. And so we know some of the folks who do this. So you can find some of them on our affiliates map. We don't know everybody who's doing it because, you know, frankly, we haven't had the resources to put into outreach to figure out who else is doing it, but it is happening on the ground. It is organic and it is fascinating. Like it has been like that for forever, you know, for the last 20 years. And now it's really gone intense with folks that are wanting to solve the problem. Jessica, can we go to you again and talk a bit about human-centered design? Why do we need to make sure that digital literacy and access take human-centered design into account, and how do we do it?
Yeah, this has been something we've been puzzling over for a while, and I just want to say to the person who asked about parent content, Common Sense Media and the California PTA and PK are great organizations. PK is PIQE, that here in California at least offer some really great resources. When I think about human-centered digital access, I also think about the mental health and social emotional aspects of learning and the things that we're all experiencing right now. COVID has so much to do with its impact on our bodies, our communities, and also our well-being, just in terms of how we're interacting with the world right now. We have a lot of young people, educators, families, for whom even just having access to technology is extremely helpful and important, but having access to connection with other humans and building communities virtually and supporting is really what's important here. When I think of human-centered design here, I do also think of one thing I mentioned earlier about the accessibility of having resources that are truly better attuned to different types of learners. But I also think that human-centered design recognizes that we always have to be nimble to how we are approaching to whatever the context is. You might open your school next week and have to close it the week after. We can't be caught off guard again suddenly that we have to close. So how are we focused on providing learners and educators? Of course, that's our sphere of influence. That's why I'm focusing on them. How are we focused on giving them the opportunity to sort of toggle between all of those worlds? But I also think it recognizes just the different changes in individual needs. If we have a student or an educator who has chronic health issues, whose chronic asthma might have kept them out of school and had led to past attendance issues, there are actually incredible opportunities and access now when we think about designing our educational infrastructure around what their needs are and what their changing needs are. There are certainly things like aspects of design thinking and being very user-focused that are often tied with human-centered design. I'll add some resources in the chat of some other folks who do interesting research on this. But I think the point here is, just as we've all experienced, we aren't just robots engaging with the technological world. We're people who have feelings, emotions, experiences of what we're dealing with in our local communities. And when we think about access to the digital world, that has to keep that in mind.
Thank you, Jessica. There's a great question from Michael in the Q&A He says there are regulatory barriers to libraries in California offering Wi-Fi beyond their physical boundaries. This is an E-rate issue. Does anyone know if there's progress in getting that waived so libraries, many of which have really great broadband in California, could potentially serve as a larger physical area? I'm going to take his question even further and say, can we use their bandwidth to get connectivity into people's homes? Ernie, this one's for you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, a lot of the, in an ironic sense, in 2015, the FCC set out the goal to connect as many schools to fiber infrastructure for gigabit plus internet as part of the E-rate program, and then the incumbents, right, the major carriers, their big victory has been to lock money that build anchor institution high capacity lines to only be allowed to be used by those anchor institutions as a means of preventing these really important government investments in high quality infrastructure to never be leveraged by the local community. And that has been acceptable for a long time up until now, when suddenly, I've seen some comments about, like, how do we get the ISPs to help distance learning now? And again, I'm just going to repeat, there is no solution there. If they have not upgraded those networks, they will not get faster in any short period of time, and they will miss this school year, right? It's a multi-year construction project to upgrade these. In 15 years, Nikolai cannot be overwritten in 6 months' time. But if the local school, the local library, and any government institution that has high capacity infrastructure that's restricted by any sort of regulatory means, and E-rate's a great example of this, we've got to be undoing those. There's no reason why we can't share that resource to the greater community, because most of those limitations were sought by the national ISPs because they understood what the future held. If people can get cheap free internet other ways to meet their needs, and their legacy investments that have long been paid off decades ago became less valuable, that's a problem for them, and therefore and the solution for them would have been to upgrade and offer superior services, which is not in their recipe.
Thank you, Ernie. There's a question from Lauren in the Q&A about foster youth. Are there programs that exist to check in and help students engage with learning while they're connecting from home, like a virtual mentor? Anyone have California specific examples? Yeah, Jean.
Yeah, so I'll just say this is a much bigger problem than people might think. LUSD did an analysis of the kids in middle school and high school who were disconnecting and essentially the summer melt, as we call it, but doing that in March when we went online. So from March to May, we analyzed, which kids under which demographics were having trouble, and people could be disconnected for lots of reasons, but some of our populations, maybe 90% of kids were connecting every day or at least every week, multiple times a week, which is great, especially in high school where some of the work is asynchronous. But our foster care youth, only 8% of them were regularly connecting, 8%. And so, so we're doubling down on, we understand that is an ultimately vulnerable population. And we also have to include our homeless youth in that as well, because they were also at about that level of connectivity. We have tutoring programs, we have mentoring programs. Our libraries are still very, very active, even if the doors are closed right now, they're active online. But kind of going back to what Ernesto and several others have said is we still have to get making sure that those kids are connected and they're accessible. And because, Angela, as you point out, they live in families, we have families with 3, 4, 5 kids who are all in school, and we give them one Wi-Fi hotspot, right? So we have to, and one computer, and their dad's also looking for a job, right? So like we have to think about what we can do immediately to help the kids who are getting lost right now, as well as those long-term plans. And our foster care and homeless youth are particularly vulnerable.
I'd love to chime in really. Oh.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Go ahead,
I'll chime in after you.
Actually, she referenced you as well, so I'm going to let you take it, and then I'll go after you.
I was going to plug an organization that we work with in California. I don't have a specific example, but I would encourage folks to check out the organization, First Place for Youth. They work with foster youth and transitional age youth, and I'm pretty sure they have some awesome programs and models that you all can look at. And I'll type that in the chat as well.
Great, thanks, Devin. Jessica?
I'm glad you went first because I second that, Devin. I'm glad you brought it up. You know, I think this is, on the one hand, an extremely broad systemic issue. We find, you know, challenges with our ability to reach out and support, especially in a sustained way, our foster and homeless youth. But each of those is a very local solution. So what we are seeing is, first of all, this conversation coming up more and more, where it needs to be had that maybe there is something where we simply need to make sure we're focusing on that even bigger discrepancy in our connectivity, whether it's in person or actually virtual, with our foster and homeless youth communities. What I will say there also is that means that maybe they will have to be the first priority cohort of learners who will come back to campus first. And that might be in a smaller group, that might be a little bit more manageable in terms of the public health and safety precautions that the school districts will have to take. But a lot of this does plug into other public services that schools and districts typically connect with. So I think a lot of this is just simply to say, here's another aspect we need to think holistically about how we're supporting the health and well-being of foster youth, homeless youth, and other youth who are facing challenges, especially like food insecurity and other issues.
Right, that's perfect. Thank you, Jessica. Jessica, can I also ask you to talk about the digital divide? So the fact that you have been working on this, so you have done some of that. Tell us about what the work that you have done and the need that's still out there.
Absolutely, just unmuting myself. As I do that, I'm going to put a link in the chat that that has a lot of resources that we had put together. So because we live in this really interesting interstitial space between public and private, we've been able to come together with the California Governor's Office, the California State Board of Education, and of course our partners at the California Department of Education to create the California Bridging the Digital Divide Fund. And we here at the CD Foundation are the administrators of it, but it involves really a huge amount of partnerships. That has been something that started, gosh, time is at a warp. So a few months ago, March, where we've already been able to raise over $12 million thanks to public and private donations from all sorts of organizations, companies, philanthropic entities to directly invest in devices. What we're finding is, while certainly the needs vary by locality, we really want to step in and not have a district have to individually reach out and see for whatever volume they're purchasing, then negotiate prices if there's even supply available. So we've stepped in to say, on the statewide level, how do we come in and use our buying power, using our knowledge of the need? Lande mentioned earlier, 700,000 to about 1 million devices still. And that is, again, based on our current learners, let alone those who are transitioning to higher education or those who are soon going to be entering our educational institutions. And to say, can we get better pricing? Can we understand what is actually realistically going to arrive when? So when you see the digital divide support link that we provided there, you'll see information from various third-party vendors and others that we'll be adding, where we negotiated lower pricing with them. We were able to determine which devices would be coming in sooner than later, so that for our back to school season, we're at least in the best position we possibly can to have the devices that we need. And I will say it's been fantastic and you know, a unique ability to leverage the scale we have in California to say, we're gonna speak to what our need is as a state, as opposed to put that burden on our schools and districts to have to do that outreach themselves. And also, I'll just say one last thing, when we step in and pay for things like that, those schools and districts can pay for other stuff that is already burdening their finances. So let's let them pay for teachers, and we can pay the devices for them. That's also a way that our private companies can step in and be a partner in changing that financial stress.
Yes, that's perfect. One of the notes in the chat refers to Human IT. So that's another refurbisher that you all have in California, well respected nationally, active within the NDIA community. It is another place where getting companies to donate the computers that they have, getting them into a place where they can be refurbished by an entity that is trusted. You all have a lot of resources in California to solve this problem, right? I'm in the national world. I'm often like, people say, well, who's the example? And too many times I'm like, California, right? And then people are like, we're not California. so I appreciate what you all have done, and I know there's still a lot of work to be done, but every now and then smile and know that you have made a lot of progress.
Thank you. And we are very, very happy to reach out. We have so many different types of communities here in California that while we are super large, we've had to address them in very, very unique and different ways. So we'd be happy to partner with folks and just share what we can about the resources and what we've learned and how else to be most effective in negotiating as soon as possible the devices and connectivity that people are needing.
That's awesome, Jessica. Thank you. You and I should definitely talk later about putting you on some more panels. I'm already on panels with everybody else here. So Shavonda has a great question in the Q&A, and I think it's a complicated one. I'm not even sure there's an answer to it. She wants to know if there's a plan to set a standard level of device functionality for students and by extension families. Jessica, can you take that one?
Sure. That's such a great question because in a way that's a moving target. I will say when it comes to talking to our third-party partners and the manufacturers, we have gathered minimum specs of what we're looking for. And for the most part, that will serve our purposes for this year's learners. I say this year's learners because we in no way should be thinking about our investments in devices and connectivity for only this year. We need to think about that as an investment for years to come. And in fact, this very eye-popping $5.3 billion amount is eye-popping, but it should be what we expect in terms of the amount of money it will take to invest in learning loss mitigation and especially in the investment in our digital infrastructure for learning. So we have minimum specs now, but I think we need to revisit the question of whether those are the minimum specs that we actually need to be thinking about for what could be, for at least for a long while, a one-time infusion of cash to make an investment in a school or district's digital infrastructure. So in that case, as I mentioned before, it is more expensive to have a touchscreen device. It is more expensive to have additional accessibility tools. It is also more expensive to make sure we have ongoing support for educators, families, and students around it. But we need to think about where that is going to be in the future. And I actually think it's an opportunity, as Ernie mentioned before, we're being forced to see the future now and to live the future now. So as I'm sure many of you have heard in the last few months, we really can't waste a crisis. And we need to think about how the investments that are coming together now can be used to get us in the best position 5-10 years from now, when especially with technology, things change so rapidly.
That's perfect. Thank you, Jessica. I think part of the question Shavonda is asking is she wants to know if we define what the minimums are, then we will uncover the divide a bit more. And then it ensures educators can use those applications, make assignments, be seen on screens, et cetera, is her point. And so I think her point is getting to not just a program setting a minimum, but the state setting a minimum, because districts setting minimums, districts have minimums, but how do families prepare for that because things are moving so fast?
Yeah, I would say it will be hard pressed to find a way to have the state do that. We're a very locally controlled and led state when it comes to our educational decisions and how our funds are distributed. But it is something where districts can do that. Their district technology managers, also working with our county offices of education, can take a look at how to bring some standardization to that. But it also, what I'm trying to stress is also that it needs to be revisited consistently, and to make sure that our minimum requirements are not going to further perpetuate the inequities we're seeing in communities of color, in lower income communities that they're experiencing, because sure, they're getting help, but are they getting the best help we can really be giving? And putting them not just so they have something, but so they're on par with folks who've been able to have more expensive, more enhanced devices. But of course, it's an ongoing question. It's certainly being discussed right now. I will look forward to having a better answer to that sooner than later.
Okay, super. Thanks, Jessica. Jean, I think the next question is for you. It's from Judy in the Q&A, and she wants to know if the City of LA negotiated with ISP providers when they were granted permits to install 5G, negotiated with them so that they would provide free access, or I would just say access at all, to low-income areas.
We negotiated, we didn't negotiate for free Wi-Fi, although we have asked. What we do is we hold them accountable for a couple of things. So we insist that they adhere to the California standard that there's internet options that are viable, not just like, 10 megabytes a month or anything, but internet options under $15, so they all come in at $14.99, but some come in less. And that we ask that they increase awareness across multiple languages to those services So we provide it through our Get Connected site, but we also ask them to advocate and support and advertise for those too. We also have several television stations that I manage for the city of Los Angeles, and so we promote it over social media and television, which does kind of connect partly across the digital divide. The other thing that we negotiate with them is that we look at where they're permitting. And so we've shared openly our data around FCC broadband data and other data that helps us to understand where most digitally disconnected communities are. And we share that data with all of the ISPs and say, we need you to connect in these communities. We're not telling you which community to connect in, because to be honest, in a city as big as LA, they're all going to get there. And we're not telling one they have to build north and one they have to build south, but we're just making sure every community is connected. And then we say, we're going to watch the permitting, and you need to be permitting in South LA, and then, you know, on the edge of Beverly Hills back into Watts, and then you can go to Pacific Palisades. So, right, so that we govern it in a way which ensures that over the last several years, we've been building out faster in our underserved neighborhoods than in our overserved neighborhoods. And that we are making sure that all of those folks have at least a base connectivity. Now what we're doing is under COVID, we are actually asking for free services, and we've been able to either get significantly improved services like data cap lifts, or in some cases, companies are saying, even if you owed us money from previous services, we're forgiving all debts currently in our system, and you can get free internet if you have a K through 12 child in the house. And so we're working on sort of like on a COVID case by case basis to try to get more out of them.
Super, thanks, Jean. Ernie, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean that's awesome, because the history of how we've had ubiquitous access has really been driven by local governments in that type of that trade-off of you know, you look at the ISP and the major national, and they have a profit motive, and they're looking to get into a lucrative city like a major city like Los Angeles, and the requirement to cover more people. One, they can make that work, right? At the end of the day, they know broadband's a high demand service. People are going to use it for their whole life. Like if we're there and people will pay for it, if it takes us 5-10 years to make our money back on this area, that's okay, because in Beverly Hills, we'll make it back in less than a year. And it's called cross subsidization and average costing of communities. Without that, right? Without policy and government kind of pushing that envelope to counteract the profit motive, what you get is digital redlining. What you get is only the most lucrative markets that will pay me back the fastest at the highest amount of money will get served, and everyone else will be ignored. And so if the number one thing all local governments should be doing, and the state of California should be doing as policy, is, you know, using 5G as as leveraging opportunity, because they want to serve it, right? They want to be able to make money from it. And you have to be able to have local government particularly be the vanguard of ensuring equity in this. So it's absolutely great to see a lot of what LA is doing through its permitting process, because that's how we've done it in the past, and it's worked.
Super, thanks, Ernie. I'm going to go to Jessica now. There's a question in the Q&A about accessible devices for those with disabilities. Can you address that barrier?
Yes, and I can't quite find it, so if I'm not being specific enough, please let me know how else I can answer it. You know, accessible devices for students with disabilities, as I mentioned earlier, can often have more expensive features to them, which immediately is a great way to have things be inequitable. But we also know that students with varying learning differences will need additional support from an adult educator that often comes in person if they have moderate to severe needs as well. What I will say is that, and this actually answers another sort of question that I saw in the chat, this is one of several areas we need to push back on the private sector about what kind of features we need to be seeing in their products. And I also want to build on what Ernie said with that. There is a default to focus, of course, for profit margins on the most lucrative areas. But if we can come together, especially for accessibility concerns for different populations who need more enhanced services when it comes to their devices, if we can come together on a larger scale to advocate for that, and to also help our private partners realize that that isn't just something they do as part of a nice philanthropic program, it should be part of how they have a double bottom line in terms of their business. So that means saying things like, how can we get a lower price for the types of features we know we're going to need. And if you need us to tell you that we're going to buy a certain volume of them so that you know you have this market available to you, and that means that various public and private partners need to come together to be able to negotiate that, then we need to do that. But at the end of the day, I will say, what's important to think about for accessible devices for those with disabilities is that a lot of the sort of average user design that we have out there can be moderately serviceable for an average user and essentially completely maintains the shutting out of a lot of other learners. So it's really important to make sure, as I think we've mentioned a number of other areas here, that we are building our awareness around how we need to fine tune our response to the needs for devices and connectivity.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. So we are wrapping up. This has been a fabulous discussion. For those who want to continue the discussion in a national context, I welcome you to NDIA. It's free to join, digitalinclusion.org. We have Friday calls every Friday, 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 o'clock Pacific. Every Friday for an hour, we put somebody on who has something amazing to share in terms of resources or in terms of models. So I'm going to turn it over to Phil to wrap it up for us.
Thank you, Angela. We're at time, but thank you to our audience for joining us for this important conversation today. And a huge thank you to our panelists for all your work in pursuing what I hope we're all starting to understand is really a fundamental 21st century right. If you're compelled by the conversation today and want to stay engaged, please start by joining our Connecting California LinkedIn group. We will send out a link to this forum for shared learning and cultivating a community of practice in a follow-up email that should be going to you guys later today. Please also look out for an invitation to the next program in our Connecting California series titled Stronger Together, the role of cross-sector partnerships in digital equity. This next conversation will focus on understanding how effective public-private partnerships can be designed and implemented, specifically at local and regional levels. We'll be sharing out key takeaways from case studies and proven models and solutions currently being implemented both in state and in cities around the country. Thank you again for joining us and for your continued partnership. Have a wonderful Thursday.